In today's workshop, we're going to talk about understanding context, connotation, and nuance when learning English vocabulary. This is a workshop by English with Kim of EnglishWithKim.com. Hey there, I'm Kim, and I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. And who might you be? Hey there, welcome back to my series of workshops on how to improve your vocabulary naturally. In this series of workshops, I am talking all about what you need to do in order to increase your vocabulary the natural way. And I'm going to be talking about techniques and approaches to vocabulary that are a little more advanced for people who are really trying to increase their vocabulary on their own by seeking out high quality texts. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But first, I want to remind you, if you haven't already seen the first two workshops in the series, please go back and review them because there's a lot of key information. I'll repeat the most important points at the beginning of this workshop, but I really want you to have a deeper understanding of this approach to vocabulary. As we go through the workshop, think about examples of situations where you have been discovering vocabulary. Think of examples that may have confused you and start to take note of them. That's really going to help you put this information into practice using the resources that I'm going to show you. I hope you enjoy the rest of this workshop, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. Don't forget to leave comments as we go through the workshop. This workshop was inspired by your questions, so I want to take a look at a couple of the questions that relate to today's topic. Why do some words have the same meaning? For example, carving and sculpture, cave and cavern, mankind and humanity, faithfulness and fidelity. These are only some examples, but I've noticed it a lot. Sometimes I'm reading or listening to videos and realize a word that I don't know, but when I put it in the translator, it returns another word which I already know. In my language, Portuguese, if you see humanidade, humanity, you will not see another word replacing that word. Why does it happen in English? This question is from Leonildo from Brazil. How to speak simple and at the same time modern and polite English? That's the main issue to which we, my students and me, are trying to focus our attention. How not to sound in an academic way? This question comes from Lena from Russia. How can I effectively enlarge my active speaking vocabulary and make my language more rich using more synonyms, adjectives, etc.? Are there any tricks or things that can lead me to this level besides speaking practice? Because where I live, we don't speak English. This is from Mary from Russia. So let's get started looking at the different ways that you can understand context, connotation, and nuance in English in order to enlarge your active speaking vocabulary, to make your language more rich and to sound more natural using the type of language that native speakers use. So first, remember to learn vocabulary in context. I've talked about this a little bit more in the earlier videos, but let's review why context is so important. When you want to improve your vocabulary beyond the intermediate level so that you sound more natural, you need to ask yourself more questions about the vocabulary you discover. This really requires you to be paying attention to the type of language you want to learn. Your awareness of key details will enable you to understand the appropriate use of the word or phrase and will help you remember what it means. When clients ask me about certain vocabulary words, phrases, or expressions, my first question is always, what was the context? This is particularly important for phrasal verbs, which may have very different definitions based on context. Idioms and slang also have very situation-dependent meanings. So let's review the questions about context that can really help you understand vocabulary and start to use it more effectively. Was the situation formal or informal? Was it professional or personal? Was the person speaking emotional or relaxed? Is the word or phrase specific to a field of work, study, or hobby? What were you talking about when you came across this word? Who were the people interacting? What were their ages? What was their social class? What were their interpersonal dynamics? All of these things affect the language. What kind of conversation strategy was it being used to achieve? What was the goal of the person speaking? Their goal is really going to influence the type of language that they're using. What was the conversation or the text about? Where will the conversation be going next? The goal is to ask yourself more questions about this new word to help you learn how to use it naturally. Now let's talk about context when you choose your resources. Like I said, we reviewed this in earlier workshops, but I want to just remind you that your resources are going to influence the context. Remember, choose high-quality input: books, articles, blog posts, podcasts, videos, movies, conversations with native speakers, and courses. In the second workshop in this series, I talk all about these different types of resources, but the key is that they're high quality. When deciding on your resource, pay attention to the type of language you feel like it'll expose you to or give you. Think critically about the text. The vocabulary you want really does depend on the context. So now let's talk about strategies that can help you understand this vocabulary in order to be sure that you're understanding the meaning. So number 2, I want you to look for the word or phrase being used in context, even if you've discovered the word somewhere else. When you're not sure of the context, don't worry. You can find examples of the word in context thanks to the power of the internet. If you know a word, but you're not sure if you're using it correctly, your first step is to look for examples of the word in context. This is important. Please don't skip this step. So here are some places where you can look for the word in context if you've just come across the word, written it down, and you're not entirely sure where you originally heard it. Look for the word in these places. Of course, you can always start with Google or another search engine. You can just enter the word and see examples of it in context. I'll show you in just a moment. You may also want to check wordreference.com. I'll show you that they have a specific place where they let you click on context so it will show you the word in recent articles on Google News. There's also a really interesting website called youglish.com where they show you the word in context in particular videos from YouTube. I'll show you in just a moment. Wordincontext.com is also a very interesting resource where when you search for a word, you see excerpts from text that will help you understand the meaning. As always, you can always check out dictionaries that include examples like collinsdictionary.com and merriam-webster.com. Let's take a look at these websites in order to see certain examples based on words that I've already talked about or words that you've asked about. So let's get started looking at a few of the websites you can use in order to find examples of words or expressions in context. So let's start out with our trusty friend Google. So as you see here, Google is a great resource in order to look up words and try to find examples in context. So let's start with the word carving. That was one of the examples that our fellow learner gave. So we have the word carving. So even just from the beginning, by the dictionary that comes up in Google, you can get sort of an understanding of when you may see the word carving, like a carving of Robert E. Lee, and kind of get a sense. That's one particular example of the word in context. You could also find a definition on Wikipedia. You see wood carving, so you're starting to get a sense. Carving on Pinterest, it's giving you a sense. Wood carving. You get some examples of wood carving and some dictionary definitions, and then pretty much by the time you get to here, you see beginner carving notes, Smoky Mountain wood carver. So you're getting a sense of the word without actually having to look up the definition, even though we did see it. If you want more recent examples of the word in context, then you want to check out the news option. So you see here, for Mystic resident Bob Sicilian, wood carving is a labor of love. So we're definitely seeing a lot of situations where carving is being connected to the word wood, because carving tends to have a certain feeling about wood, right? It's something that you're carving out of wood. And you see another example here, carving. Now this is a special use, carving a niche. We're using carving in a different way here, but that's giving you a sense of the word in context. Here we have another wood carving, how to carve out a career, which is a phrasal verb with carving a path, another thing that you can start understanding, but it's even giving you a sense of the phrasal verbs just by looking at the word in context. So Google is a great first step in order to look for the word in context. So let's take a look at my favorite resource, wordreference.com. I particularly love their app because it makes it much more portable, and I like the way that they approach language. So we can search for the word carving here as well. So let's take a look at carving. Here you have more information on carving. And the reason I'm showing you word reference is you could start looking up the definition, the etymology, start looking at more information about the word carving. But I like that right here, they have this in context option. You can choose this in context option in order to immediately get some examples of the word in context. And the reason I like this with carving, well, this is one word, but they put it in quotation marks. And these quotation marks mean you're going to get those words together. This is especially helpful if you have a word or phrase that's more than one word, right? So let's take a look at the one we looked at previously, which is looking at pep talk. So pep talk is a good example of where you would want to look in the word in context. It's a compound noun, so you're going to be able to look for this in context through word reference just by clicking in context. They automatically add the quotation marks so that you're able to see the words together. So that's a really good thing to do if you're using Google and you're looking up an expression, and I'll give some examples in just a second. So Danilo motivated by pep talk, the stern pep talk that helped savage Rory. So in this situation, you're going to see all of these, how to give a good pep talk according to science. You're starting to see the word in context. So you're going to get a sense of the word from looking at the word in context. Another expression that I talk about a lot is train of thought. So if you look this up, you're going to get some sort of, oh, this one doesn't have this exact phrase. So let's actually look at the word in context so you can see that it is actually something you'll see as a complete phrase. A different train of thought. He goes on to continue his train of thought right here. Are his train of thought lyrics. So you get a sense that this is actually an expression that's common in culture, even though it didn't show up in word reference. So you can just click, it will automatically include the quotation marks, which is what makes Google know that you want to search for all of those words together. So I hope that helped you understand how to use word reference. So another thing that you can do that I think is really cool is you can look inside Youglish for learning different words and context inside videos. So it will find this video. So let's start out looking for the word carving. We'll see if it's there and see if you can find it. This will help you improve your pronunciation, and depending on what it returns, you may be able to listen to something interesting and actually learn about the word in context. I think it really depends on what comes up. So this will show a video. She does a lot of wood carving. So if we go backwards in just a moment, she does a lot of wood carving for a living. So you have somebody talking and they're mentioning wood carving. So right there, you're going to get something related to this in this video. This is a great resource, which one of the members of the English with Kim community shared with me, and I highly suggest checking it out. Maybe let's look for pep talk too, to see if we can find a similar option here. And look at this, you can also choose US, UK, and Australia if you want to focus on the word in context in a particular region. So here you have how to pronounce pep talk in English, and we have here Barack Obama, and you see it never hurts to get a pep talk from a general, right? So that gives you a sense of the word pep talk, because we talked about pep talk in a previous video, and pep talk is something that someone in a position of authority gives you. So a pep talk from a general to a president is probably a pretty good example. So this is a great resource to hear the word in context, and then you can listen to the video if you want to keep going. Okay, this is also pretty cool. I just discovered this, which is wordincontext.com. Let's see if they have the word carving in context. This is great. So as you see, there are all kinds of examples from different books. I see. They're all books that are available publicly. So you can see, although not translatable into carving, their main business is wood carving. So I'm starting to see a trend, wood carving, wood carving. The various colored stones at which they are carving their history, and that's an expression, with the carving of a lotus bud on its end. So just by looking at this word in context, you're starting to get a sense of what it means without even needing to look up the definition. Let's try humanity. Humanity at its noblest. It was a mere instinct of humanity. So you get a sense of how this word would be used, the type of text that you would see this word in, and consequently of the humanity which is due to them, a different use of the word humanity, the revival of humanity, frightfulness above humanity. So all of these different examples give you a sense of the word in context. Other resources I also enjoy are dictionaries, because dictionaries are really geared to try to help you understand the vocabulary word, and they have lots of different levels. So let's look up carving in this dictionary. Carving. So we're getting the definition. We're starting to see the definition, which is great if you want to have a sense of the word. But let's see if we can find some examples of carving in a sentence. So I love this as a resource. Here you have examples of carving in a sentence. She bought a small wooden carving of a Buddha. An ancient people proficient in stone carving. So you're getting a sense, wood carving, stone carving. We've seen that in a couple of different examples. So you can start to understand what carving means and start to remember it from these examples. Here are some recent examples of carving from the web. These lion heads, the balcony carvings, and many other details come from the fine architectural wood carving company Enkabol. The carvings represent the first evidence of skull decoration in the archaeological record of the region. And then this is another example with wood carving. So these are recent examples. Look at this one's from June, July. These are all recent examples. This is particularly helpful when we start talking about connotation and nuance. The connotations of the words can change over the years. So if you noticed in word in context, some of those were old-fashioned uses of the word. But here, these are recent examples from the web. It's even easier than Google because there are specific examples that are selected from online news sources that Merriam-Webster trusts. So thank you. We can also look up pep talk. Let's see if we can find some recent examples from the web as well. So pep talk, here again, we have the definition where they're explaining what it means. And keep scrolling until we get the examples of pep talk in a sentence. The coach gave the team a pep talk before the game. She needs a pep talk. So these are all ways you can use the word pep talk. And it looks like there's no recent examples. They show the first known use of pep talk, but you see here they have definitions for English language learners. So if you want something that may be a little simpler. So I don't see one there. Let's look up humanity and see what we can find for humanity. So we have a couple of different definitions of humanity, and we'll talk more about humanity a little bit later. Examples in a sentence. We appealed to his sense of humanity. These discoveries will be of benefit to all humanity. Recent examples from the web. My snapshot with Steinem seemed to be saying something about this common humanity. So this is something from July. All had precisely honed insights about the nature of humanity and of evil that remade expectations of what TV could do, from June. His friends and family came from around the country to tell stories about him, about his essential humanity. So all you can see here are examples that are recent, that are from news sources, so you can start to understand the word in context. This is great as you try to look for more advanced vocabulary that's more precise to express your meaning. Okay, so Merriam-Webster is a great resource. I am also a big fan of Collins Dictionary. So let's take a look here at the word carving. So we have our definition of carving. Some food over there. Carving, right? We have the pronunciation, which is great. As I mentioned in the first workshop, you should definitely listen to it and make sure you practice it. So we have more example sentences containing carving. The stones and carvings talk to me, and the carvings and paintings that tell the myths are still there. You get a sense of the art related to the carvings, the older art. And what I love is that this particular resource also shares dates. So you get a sense of when this was published, so you know that you're dealing with something more modern. So you're getting this more modern connotation. This is really, really, really important to understand. And then they talk about when carving, it's one of the 10,000 most commonly used words, and you can keep going. But these example sentences are great, and they are also from recent texts. Let's take a look at pep talk. So we have the definition as well. And look, actually, I didn't see this the first time. You can jump to the example sentences. So if you're trying to learn words in context without getting distracted by the definition and kind of analyzing it, this is a great thing you can use. They were not expected to give pep talks. It's the implication that sports people cannot be bothered unless they are given a pep talk. He has been given a pep talk and totally accepts how he has to behave and exactly why. At the very least, give yourself a pep talk. So all of these examples give you a sense of the word pep talk. The next step to understanding connotation and nuance is to pay attention to context clues. So let's talk about what we mean by context clues. When trying to understand the meaning of the word and the best way to use it, you want to look for key details about the word or phrase in the sentence as well as the whole paragraph. Your vocabulary will improve more quickly when you try to figure out the word for yourself first. Remember, this is how you learn as a native speaker too. So now let's look at some examples of context clues that can help you get some information about the vocabulary word before you start looking it up. You can start with the word itself. You can look at the root word, the prefix, or the suffix on the word in order to get some comparisons between vocabulary you already have. Remember, English has a lot of roots in many different languages, so you might recognize root words either from your native language if there's a relationship or from other words you've already learned. Another category of context clues are synonyms, comparisons, and definitions. In this case, you're going to be looking for similar words within the sentence that give clues to what the word actually means, as well as comparisons that can give you some idea of how the words are interconnected. And you may also look for definitions. I tend to define my terms several times when I'm speaking because I want to make sure the meaning is really clear. So sometimes people who are doing that in writing also will give similar definitions of what the word means or what it means in this particular text. So look for synonyms, comparisons, and definitions. You may also want to look for antonyms and contrasts, the opposite. So you may find an example in the text that is the complete opposite, and they indicate this is the complete opposite of what the person wanted. So you'll be able to look for these particular antonyms or contrasts in order to give you clues to what the word you don't know actually means. Another way to look for context clues is to look for examples, explanations, or illustrations. Like I said a moment ago, sometimes people rephrase things in a different way, or they give examples that can help clue you in to what the word means if you're not familiar with it. So look for some sort of example, maybe an explanation, or some illustration, some visual, or some imaginary situation where you can start to feel what the word means. Of course, you can also look to your logic or get the general gist of the word or your sense of the word. So this is by just understanding what you think the word means from what's going on in the entire sentence or paragraph or even the text. Use your logic. You get the gist of the word. You don't necessarily need the precise definition if you have an understanding of what it means. And of course, you can also pay attention to the style and tone of the text. Refer to our questions about context. This can really clue you in if this word is more casual or more formal, professional or personal, if it's a specific strategy. There's lots of different questions we already talked about, but the style and tone of the text can give you a sense of what the word means. So now let's talk a little bit more about considering roots and cognates. Like I said just a moment ago, English has a lot of roots. Many non-native English speakers find spelling and pronunciation challenging because English has so many roots in other languages. Understanding the Greek, Latin, and Germanic roots of the words can help you determine the meaning. When you start to recognize certain elements of the words, vocabulary seems less challenging. So I want to show you this useful resource that I happened to find just by searching Google when we're talking about root words, roots, and affixes, right? Prefixes and suffixes. So it is a really, really important thing to start studying if you really want to start deciphering vocabulary on your own by understanding the connections between the different words thanks to the relationships in the language, right? So this is great because we have the common Latin and Greek roots where you have ambi, which means both, and they give you examples. examples. So you can start studying these roots in order to start understanding what the word might mean by the pieces of the words. This is actually how native English speakers learn vocabulary when we're in high school and we're trying to gain a more academic and more professional vocabulary for college and later for jobs. We start studying these roots and because we want to be able to determine the word based on this little portion of the word. So this can help you guys understand these different roots and kind of guess what it means. You can also see there are some common Greek roots here, right? These are common in many languages where you might be familiar with their similar Greek history in the words, and that can help you also determine the words. So some people may have an advantage based on their native language. Now, you can also understand by analyzing the different parts of these words. You have the prefixes here where you can start seeing what they mean and then seeing some examples. So I just encourage you to take a look at this on your own time, and there you have your suffixes so you can start understanding what this probably means and start deconstructing the words so you can figure out parts you recognize. That's something I always suggest when you're trying to understand a new word in context. See what parts of the word you recognize. So let's take a look at this example that was suggested by our friend from Brazil. We have humanity versus mankind. With regards to these two words, the roots of the words can help you understand why we have so many synonyms for the same concept. With the word humanity, the roots are Latin, which is why it relates to Portuguese and Spanish and other Romance languages. They might have similar words, so it's a Latin root. Where mankind, the roots are Germanic. So those of you who speak a Germanic language recognize kind and man from your language. And people tend to say humankind these days. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So in this case, choose which word sounds better for the flow of the sentence. Remember, humanity has that softer Latin sound. Mankind has that forceful sound. If you're writing poetry, there might be a better example, or maybe you just want a little bit of variety in your sentence or variety in your paragraph, so you might want to vary these two words. So this is why you might see words that have almost exactly the same meaning in English. Now let's talk about phrasal verbs versus Latin cognates. Many speakers of Latin-based languages struggle with using vocabulary words that look similar in their language, like the word humanity. When you're first learning English, it can seem easier to choose the Latin cognate, and as you become more advanced, you realize native speakers often prefer phrasal verbs outside of formal academic contexts. So this can be a challenge as you continue to seek out more advanced vocabulary. If you're always choosing the cognate, but the phrasal verb is more commonly used, it's not going to sound supernatural. So you definitely want to start thinking about the phrasal verbs that can replace these Latin cognates. Now let's talk about cognates, false cognates, and false friends. These are some linguistic terms that may help you understand what's going on and maybe kind of stopping you from achieving what you want in English. So let's start by defining our terms. Cognates are words that have a similar etymological origin or root, a similar meaning, and may even sound alike. We'll look at a couple of examples in just a bit. False cognates are words that seem to be cognates because they have similar sounds and meaning, but they actually have different roots. False friends are words in two languages that look or sound similar but have very different meanings. So now let's take a look at some examples. For examples of cognates, we have artificial, plural, psychology, and music. If you speak a language that has some roots in Latin or even Greek, you may recognize these words, and they have almost exactly the same meaning in various languages. So now let's look at some examples of false cognates. This is an example actual in English and actual in German. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that, where these words have different roots, but they may have similar meanings, so they seem like they're cognates, but they're actually not. And now my favorite, let's talk about some examples of false friends. As you become more advanced in a language, you start understanding the nuances and choosing the more appropriate word, not the word that's most related to your native language. So let's talk about sensible and sensitive. A lot of people, when they want to say sensitive in English, which means you take things kind of personally or you feel a little emotional, they use the word sensible because in Spanish or Portuguese, sensible means sensitive. But in English, sensible actually means that something's a good idea. The person has good reasoning. They're a sensible person. They make sensible decisions. Similarly, there's a lot of confusion between the word actually in English and a similar version, actualmente, in Spanish or Portuguese or other languages related to Latin, where actually in English means in reality, and actualmente means right now. If you're choosing to use the word actually to mean right now, that's actually not the appropriate use of the word in English. We use actually a lot, but not to mean right now. Just to make things slightly more complex, let's talk about loanwords. What are loanwords? Now, this is from Wikipedia, where they talk about false friends. As well as producing completely false friends, the use of loanwords often results in the use of a word in a restricted context, which may then develop new meanings not found in the original language. For example, angst means fear in a general sense, as well as anxiety in German, but when it was borrowed into English in the context of psychology, its meaning was restricted to a particular type of fear described as a neurotic feeling of anxiety and depression. Also, gymnasium meant both a place of education and a place for exercise in Latin, but its meaning was restricted to the former in German and to the latter in English, making the expressions into false friends in those languages as well as in Greek, where it started out as a place for naked exercise. So as you can see, even though the word may have come from a language, its particular meaning has changed as it becomes used in different languages. So you really want to make sure that the word is the most appropriate for the context. And let's talk a little bit more about that. So let's talk about understanding nuance. False friends and similar but not quite the same words can be challenging as you continue to improve your vocabulary and work to sound more natural. For example, the word discussion in English means an interesting, engaging, thoughtful conversation. In Spanish, discusión means a fight or argument. That's a pretty big difference, right? So if you're thinking that the word in English means a fight or argument, you're not going to use it, even though it's the most appropriate word for the situation. In addition, translators like Google Translate or a translating app can return words that do not capture the nuance that is needed to fully express your meaning. For example, the word satisfied is used in many languages to indicate you're happy with a job well done, but in English, satisfied means that the job was sufficient or just good enough. It is not a compliment, it is just sufficient. So what do you say when you've had enough food to eat and you don't want to continue eating? In Spanish and Portuguese, you say, I'm satisfied. In English, it's more common to say, I'm full. And to be honest, I'm satisfied sounds weird in English. This is why you have to translate for meaning, not for matching cognates. Pay attention to nuance. I had a student from Brazil who refused to say I'm full because she thought it sounded rude in English, but it actually sounds normal in English, it just sounds rude in Portuguese. So context can help you understand nuance, but you need to make note of context clues and other important details. Make sure you're paying attention to what's going on in the situation. Now let's talk about figuring out connotation. This is where things get more complex. Connotation is an idea or feeling that a word suggests in addition to its literal or primary meaning. The connotation of a word can evolve over time based on its use by certain people or generations or other things. This can help you understand why we may choose one word over another. You can often decipher connotation from context using all of the tools that we've been talking about through this workshop. Now, it's important to understand that connotation requires a cultural understanding of the language. This is why connotation may vary between American English, British English, Australian English, Irish English. It can also be regional. So you really have to have a deeper understanding and a deeper sensitivity to the connotations that come from the culture. The reason that translations between languages are not always ideal is because they don't often take connotation into consideration. The same word can have several different meanings. Different words can have similar meanings, but the best word choice will depend on the desired connotation. When looking up the definition of a word, consider your contextual questions. Remember, positive or negative are their qualifiers that give you more of a sense of the word. Is the situation formal, informal, official, or casual? Is the text or conversation intellectual, academic, professional, or laid back? What is the age, gender, race, education level, or socioeconomic group of the person speaking? All of these things are influences on culture that will also influence the connotation of the word. Some words may be okay in one context and completely weird in another context. Connotation is really important to pay attention to. Now let's talk about expanding your vocabulary. Americans tend to prefer clear, simple vocabulary rather than complex, academic-sounding words. I talk about this more in my video on how to use clear, simple vocabulary to sound more professional in English. The link will be below. But here's a very common saying in American English. Don't use a $5 word when a 50-cent word will do. This is said by Mark Twain, one of our beloved authors. A $5 word is one of those long, complex words where a 50-cent word is one that is simpler, fewer syllables. If you're using cognates or direct translations from your language, try looking for simpler versions or phrasal verbs in your favorite dictionary. This is particularly important for people who may speak a language where there is a lot of cognates, such as Spanish, Portuguese, French, or Italian, and you may also run into this problem with more complex words if you speak a language like Russian or a similar language to that, where you may be using the translation that is a little more complex than what an American would use. In order to enrich your vocabulary and use better active vocabulary words, you want to look for the simpler version or even the phrasal verbs in your favorite dictionary. You want to make sure your vocabulary includes clear language as well as more nuanced words. Sometimes people have a tendency to have all of the nuanced words, but they actually need the clearer, simpler words. You may need to use more descriptive adjectives, adverbs, or noun clauses rather than a precise noun. A lot of my students and clients are always surprised when I tell them that we don't have a word for that. We tend to explain it using noun clauses, or we tend to add adjectives and adverbs in order to explain the word a little more clearly. We tend to be more precise rather than with a particular vocabulary word with the language we're using to give more details and describe descriptive adjectives and adverbs, as well as noun clauses. Learning vocabulary in context can help you determine natural sounding word pairings. This is really key. If you learn the vocabulary in context, you're going to see the words that go around it. You're going to learn words and phrases and chunks, which I've talked about in the other workshops in this series. Use the resources available to you. The resources you have are going to give you the clues you need to find natural sounding vocabulary that will help you expand the way that you speak English. If you feel like you're always using the same basic vocabulary, this is where you want to investigate words using a thesaurus and start exploring the nuances between words and learning about connotation. Writing down various examples from real-life sources will help you learn the language people actually use. So go back to the beginning of this workshop and start looking for your vocabulary in context. Write down these examples. Remember these examples. Investigate the words using the resources that are out there. So let's look at some examples of what we've been talking about and talk about where to look for more answers. So let's talk about these similar sounding words: faithfulness, fidelity, and loyalty. These words are different in English. Faithfulness is the state of being faithful. We tend to talk about being faithful in an intimate relationship, so that's the connotation the word takes on. Fidelity is faithfulness to promises, vows, obligations, duties, or ideals, including marriage vows, which is why you also hear people talk about infidelity. Loyalty is faithfulness to a person, group, nation, or leader. We are loyal to our friends and our sports teams. We usually talk about loyalty in terms of support. And something that's interesting to consider is that you can be loyal to somebody without being faithful to them in the romantic relationship. So there's a lot of different connotations on these words where even though they seem to have very similar meanings, they may not be appropriate in every context because of these feelings or senses that are understood culturally by the use of the words. Now let's take a look at carving versus sculpture. A carving is a piece of art or a handmade object usually created by removing material. We often associate carving with wood and clay. A sculpture is a broader term that includes carving, modeling, and welding. You can create a sculpture by carving and also by adding material. Sculpture often, but not always, connotes a work of art by a sculptor rather than a craftsman or artisan. There's lots of connotation, and deciding whether or not to use the word carving or sculpture is going to be really related to the context, the people that you're talking with, the way you're talking about the piece of art, whether you really respect craftsmen and artisans like I do, or whether you think art has to be created by very famous sculptors from the Renaissance era. It really depends on all of these different elements of connotation. So now let's look at cave versus cavern. A cave is a large hole in a cliff, hill, or underground where some portion of it does not receive sunlight. A cavern is a type of cave or a chamber of a cave. The word is often used to refer to any large enclosed space, especially a space that's as dark as a cave, like a large, empty, dark theater. So as you can see, even though cave describes the broader category, cavern tends to be the word people use in order to describe these dark spaces because it gives that sense of being more closed. There's a lot of different nuances that go in with cave and cavern if you're talking more scientifically, so I encourage you to check it out in your favorite dictionary. So let's go back to mankind versus humanity and talk about the connotations with these words. Mankind means all human beings or the human race. This word is actually less popular these days because it seems to favor males over females. That's why people start saying humankind. Humanity means all human beings too. It can also mean the fact or quality of being human, human nature, human qualities, or characteristics. We often talk about our common humanity or what we share being human beings. So you can see these words, even though they technically have the same meaning, they have particular uses and connotations that are specific to what you're trying to express. So let's take a look at the Collins Dictionary and look at the word humanity, just to get a sense of how you can start to determine the different ways you may use humanity, right? So they have all the people in the world can be referred to as humanity. A person's humanity is their state of being a human being rather than an animal or an object. He was under discussion and it made him feel deprived of his humanity. Then you also have it as a countable noun. It's the quality of being kind, thoughtful, and sympathetic towards others. So as you can see here, just glancing at these definitions, humanity is quite different than mankind. Mankind is used just in one way, and humanity has different senses. So you're really going to need the context in order to determine which version of humanity, which connotation of humanity that you're looking for. And then you also have humanity in the American use, humanity in the British use, and then we also have our example sentences containing humanity. This should reignite it and thus save humanity. One of the great myths about humanity is that we are in charge, yet the narrative is full of humanity and profoundly moving. So I really encourage you, if you're trying to understand the connotation of a word, take a look at a number of examples. Be sure to take a look at how these different words give you a sense of when this word is appropriate. These are examples, looks from books, we've got newspaper articles, so you're getting a couple of different senses of how people tend to use the word humanity. Now let's talk about our favorite phrasal verbs. Let's look at the example with pick up versus grasp, arrest, resume, etc. Pick up has a lot of different meanings. Let's look at the entry in Collins Dictionary online. Now we're going to look at the phrasal verb pick up. This is interesting because there are so many potential uses of the word pick up. And so I definitely encourage you, if you're struggling with understanding the precise meaning of a phrasal verb and you really want to remember it, you want to remember the context. Remember the context when the phrasal verb occurred, because this is going to help you understand the meaning. You're going to use your other context clues in order to figure out which meaning of the phrasal verb is exactly right. So use all of those clues in the sentence and in the bigger paragraph. So let's look at some examples of the phrasal verb pick up. When you pick something up, you lift it up. When you pick yourself up after you've fallen or been knocked down, you stand up rather slowly. You have an example. Tony picked himself up and set off along the track. So I'm not going to read all of these definitions to you. You can definitely check them out at the wonderful collinsdictionary.com. But as you can see here, there's lots of different meanings of this phrasal verb. It's entirely possible to use them in many different ways. So you definitely have to think about your context. There's a difference between where did you pick up your English and he had picked her up at a nightclub where she worked as a singer. There's completely different meanings. So context clues are really going to help you understand the different meanings. If you pick up an illness, you get it from somewhere. They've picked up a really nasty infection from something they've eaten. All of these definitions are different. How many are there? Wow, okay, so we get all the way to 12 different meanings, and then we also have this expression to pick up speed, and you can use it as a noun as well, so it gets a little more confusing. This is great too. The reason I wanted to show you the Collins Dictionary is they give you the American version, right? So sometimes phrasal verbs vary between countries, so this gives you a sense of the uses that are most common in American English. And then let's jump down to the example sentences. The performance will pick up in the second half. And then in training, we picked up an injury. So you have a lot of different examples here that will help you see the word in context, but once you have the word in context, you can determine what the meaning is based on what's going on with the other context clues. So I hope that helps you understand how much information you can get from using these online resources. As you want to continue to improve your vocabulary using these type of resources, you absolutely want to make sure that you're paying attention to context. The great thing about these type of resources is that they are designed to help you understand the different connotations. The examples will really help you determine which one is most related to the situation where you discovered the word. In many languages, you would look for a more precise vocabulary word, since pickup can mean so many different things. But in English, we tend to include more context so that the meaning is clear. If you're not sure you used the right word, use more details to explain. Don't wait for the perfect word. One of the reasons that so many non-native speakers feel stuck when they're trying to move to become more advanced or fluent English speakers is that they think there's a perfect word that they need in order to express themselves, when they actually just need to use more details, more examples, or more explanation in order to make sure the other person understands exactly what it is they want to say. The goal is not having a more perfect word. The goal is making sure the context gives you all the clues you need in order to understand. Now here's what I want you to consider. These are subtle but important differences that can affect how natural you sound. But remember, your meaning will still be clear based on context. Even though your goal may be to sound more natural, it's probably more important to make sure your meaning is clear. So don't be afraid to give those extra examples, those clearer explanations, more details, and be more descriptive. Now, as you continue to improve your vocabulary, don't forget to reflect and review. This is key to being sure you remember the vocabulary and it starts to move into your more active vocabulary. Here's what you can do to reflect and review. You can rewatch the show or video or listen to the podcast with a deeper understanding of the new language. Then you'll be able to start picking up on the nuance and the connotation in the context. You can reread the book, article, or blog post with this deeper understanding to make sure you're seeing all of the context clues as you've continued to evolve your understanding of this particular language. Of course, you also want to review your notes regularly. The best way to make sure you remember is to write it down and then continue to review. And you want to pay attention to when you hear it again. This is going to show that you're more aware of this vocabulary and you'll start understanding the context and situations when people use it. You'll understand the connotation and nuance, and soon it will become part of your active vocabulary as well. So let's review what we talked about today. We talked about understanding context, connotation, and nuance when learning English vocabulary. Now, number 1, we talked about remembering to learn vocabulary in context. Number 2, we looked for the word or phrase being used in context. Number 3, we talked about paying attention to context clues and talked about specific context clues that can help you get a deeper understanding of the vocabulary. Number 4, we talked about considering roots and cognates and how the language that we already have may influence our understanding of English. Number 5, we talked about understanding nuance and understanding the subtleties of the language, understanding the better ways to use it that sound more natural. Number 6, we talked about figuring out connotation, paying attention to what's going on, understanding the different connotations based on their uses and based on having a deeper knowledge of a culture. Number 7, we talked about expanding your vocabulary, ways to look for more simple vocabulary or ways to find more descriptive ways to express yourself. Number 8, we talked about examples and where to look for more answers. In number 9, we said don't forget to reflect and review. You have to reflect on what it is you've already learned about this vocabulary and continue to review for it to become part of your active vocabulary and help you sound more natural when speaking English. So now I'd love to hear from you. Do you have any questions? After watching this workshop, I hope you feel more confident increasing your vocabulary the natural way. Understanding connotation and nuance is really key to sounding more natural and more like a native English speaker as you continue to advance your vocabulary skills, you continue to improve the way that you speak, and you continue to discover vocabulary on your own. Once again, I'm Kim from EnglishWithKim.com. I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend. Now I want to hear from you. What are some of the words that you're going to look into? What are some words you've discovered through this method? Please be sure to leave a comment and let me know. Have a good one. Goodbye.